Sorry. Okay, you're good now.
So yeah, if three other campaigns that are all doing push polling all have me at the same spot in the race, that sounds like we have a shot at making the runoff. And I think canvassers have knocked on something like 15,000 doors so far, and they're going to be working through Election Day, and then we'll do polling places with push cards. I think we've got like another 20,000 push cards to hand out on Election Day. So everything's clicking along. It's very frustrating to be in a race that nobody polls publicly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Sam has returned to the call.
My dog cut me off. She doesn't want me doing this.
Fair. All right. Well, then let's call it to order at 6:34, and hopefully Mr. Redpath will be able to join us, but if not, we will proceed anyway. The reason for the call is to approve either preparing or joining an amicus brief in Utah Republican Party versus Cox. Oliver, do you want to take a minute and just quickly kind of go over where we're at and what our options are?
Sure. As I've tried to communicate in emails to the committee in the last few days, we do have the opportunity to join a brief that would be filed on behalf of the Libertarian Party of California as well as some other non-libertarian entities that I listed in my email. That, I think, logistically is obviously the preferable path if the committee wants to go forward with this, although I understand that in ideal circumstances, at least some members would prefer that the LNC file its own brief. But again, the deadline for doing that is November 12th, which leaves not very much time. And then regardless of which path we choose, whether the LNC decides to file its own brief or join another brief, we will have to file a notice of our intent to do that by November 2nd. So those are the general options, at least procedurally. I'm happy to discuss the case, excuse me, as I understand it, or how do you want to proceed, Mr. Chairman?
I guess I would ask, are there any executive committee members that have specific questions for Oliver about the case or?
Mr. Chairman, this is Jim Lark. In the goals that were stated, can I discuss, since the brief was provided that was privileged and confidential, can I discuss specific aspects of that on this call? Because I wanted to ask Mr. Hall a question about that.
I think that would be all right to do. I asked for confidentiality simply because I didn't want to share their outline in a written form that could be distributed, but obviously we need to talk about the substance of this matter, so I think it's fine to do so now.
Okay, go ahead, Jim.
All right, thank you. The goal number 2 listed on the item that I received reads as follows: establish that states may regulate whether political parties use a primary or caucus to nominate candidates for general ballot, but only if the regulation passes strict scrutiny. I guess my preference would be that states not really determine whether political parties use a primary or caucus, whether the regulation passes strict scrutiny or not.
I think that your point is probably consonant with the position of the other amici and the petitioner in this case. They may be making that concession that begins that goal. In other words, that states may regulate the choice between primary and caucus because case law apparently indicates that states do have that power. But if it's the consensus of the executive committee, I could certainly convey that our position would be that that concession shouldn't be made.
Thank you, Mr. Hall.
Thank you.
Other questions for Oliver?
This is Sam Goldstein. I've got a quick question about financially. Is there a significant financial difference between joining a brief, I assume there is, and writing one of our own or having one written for us?
Well, yes, most likely. Of course, first of all, we have to find an attorney who has the time and willingness to write the brief in the time before the November 12th deadline. And then we would have to negotiate a fee with that attorney. I suggested that $2,500 might be about the going rate, simply because that's the sort of price we've been able to pay in the past, although, as I think Mr. Bishop Henchman mentioned, it is kind of a steal at that price. But I think that a lot of times we can find attorneys who are interested in helping out on a quasi pro bono basis, and that's what I would have in mind. Although I should say I don't have any particular leads lined up on that front, which is, again, why I was suggesting that joining another brief might be preferable at this point.
On printing costs, if we join another amicus, is that split pro rata, or do you know what the custom is? Is there custom?
Yeah, we haven't discussed that specifically. I was asked by actually Petitioners Council if the LNC would be willing to share the cost of printing the brief, and I said it was something that I would raise with the committee. So I think that my sense is, reading between the lines, that they would be happy for the LNC to join, whether the LNC contributed any money or not. But of course, they would also be even happier if the LNC would also contribute some share of the printing costs.
And printing costs for an amicus brief are roughly $1,500.
That's a fair estimate. It really depends on how long the brief is. This one, from what we've seen so far, I would anticipate being rather short, in which case I think $1,500 is probably about right.
So it would be the difference between being on the hook for all $1,500 plus counsel's costs versus potentially sharing part of $1,500.
Correct.
If we were
That's my
to
best estimate, I should say.
Go ahead, Sam.
I've got another quick question. If we were to participate, Oliver, in just signing on to somebody else's brief, we would most likely want to read that before we gave final approval. So what's the timeline on being able to do that?
That, of course, is a reasonable expectation, and I think that they would have to agree to that. They did not tell me any date certain by which they would provide a draft for our review. But I think that if the LNC votes to go forward with this, we would simply tell them, the condition is we need to be able to review and approve a draft by, whatever date we decide, so that we have that contingency built in.
Other questions?
I would just add to what was said earlier that the strict scrutiny thing in there kind of bugged me a bit as well. I'm not so certain that concession is necessary, and I certainly don't like it.
Okay. I think that that's a point that I would have to discuss that with the author of the brief in detail. But again, I think at least in spirit they would certainly agree with your sentiment, and So I would just have to raise that issue with them to see why they've included that sort of equivocation.
So I'm going to interject just a little bit outside the presiding role. My guess is strategically that if they don't concede that there's any circumstance under which a government can regulate a political party's choice of caucus or primary, then there's a sense that it just sounds like they're trying to not sound unreasonable because they don't want to trigger the court to say, are you saying that a state government has no control over political parties operating in their elections? And the question is whether or not the amicus writers want to defend that position, and if defending that position is going to, nobly lose the battle in an attempt to win the broader war. Not to overly advocate for the position, but they may be thinking that by setting the standard at the highest level of scrutiny that's commonly understood by the Supreme Court, that they're saying that very little regulation can be done, without a clear and compelling governmental interest and narrowly tailored remedy. But
I think that's a good point, and I would also add, elsewhere in the cert petition, the petitioner recognizes that states do have an interest in regulating in this area, if only to prevent discrimination on the basis of race and that sort of thing. So there is a line of precedent recognizing that the state has legitimate interests in regulating in this area, but those cases that I'm referring to do involve strict scrutiny. So it may be that the amicus author is simply trying to mirror what the petitioner is arguing.
I'm just not comfortable putting our name to that. I know this is just an outline, and the way it might be worded in the brief could be a bit more weaselly, saying this is what the law is, whether we agree with it or not, which is a statement I'm comfortable with. To just say this is what it is, that makes it sound like it's okay. And I am not comfortable putting a libertarian name to that. I know there's a way to word it to still let the court know we recognize reality, but without bowing to it, is what I'm saying.
Right. I think, I guess I'll kind of direct this to Dr. Lark and Ms. Harlows. If we were to present to the court the idea that in deciding this case, they should not allow any further amount of governmental regulation of a political party beyond what is already extant in this line of precedent having to do with, strict scrutiny for racially discriminatory stuff. Does that resolve your issue, or is there still a discomfort?
No, that's why I'd like to see the thing. There's a way to word it that you're not, I know it's an outline. The way it was worded in the outline is bad. But the brief itself, yeah, I know lawyers, you guys, I know. You'll find a way to word it. I'm just trying to make it clear what my discomfort was.
Dr. Lark.
Mr. Chairman, I believe there are ways in which perhaps there are ways in which one could word the petition to make it clear that perhaps that not every amicus agrees with every point that is being made here. That perhaps I can conceive of language that would, if not completely alleviate, would at least allow me to say, yes, this is something in which we can participate. But I have problems with granting the right of the state to tell political parties in what way they can nominate their candidates. I realize that there are all manner of problems in that passed in this country, but I really don't like giving the states the power. I believe that is something that should be retained by the political parties. I do believe political parties are private organizations. So I would like to see the language I don't want to be unduly punctilious, but I really feel I would need to see the language before I could be comfortable with saying, yes, we want to sign on to this.
Yeah. Oliver, I think some of what this comes down to is we spent a lot of money and time in San Francisco VU, or Libertarian Party San Francisco VU, in getting that concession from the court that political parties have the right to nominate as they choose and are sort of self-regulating. So we just want to make sure that we're not giving that back in any way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think, I mean, are you confident that you can raise this with the other amici in a way that they'll back off of conceding that the government does have a role in this regard, or at least say, the government should have no more role than it already has, if that, something like that?
I am perfectly comfortable with raising this issue and stating our position on it, and indicating that there is a certain point at which it will be a deal breaker for us. And I can't predict what their response will be. As I've said, I think that they are sympathetic to this point, and it may just be a case of somewhat sloppy wording in the outline itself, or there may be more strategic reasons, as you've suggested, for them to make this concession. But all I can do is raise it with them and let them know that it's an important point and potentially a deal breaker if we're not able to, phrase it in a way that makes everybody comfortable. And I'll just have to get their response.
All right. Other questions for Oliver?
Not for Oliver, but have we reached out to the Utah LP, and maybe I missed it in the email string, have they said one way or the other what their preference is in this matter?
Yes, Richard Longstreth had talked to Chair Bookman. It was in that email string, and they were very much in favor of our involvement.
Okay. And willing to put up some money, I think.
Oh, that helps.
Potentially, yeah.
Potentially even better.
Pardon me, Mr. Chairman. Do I infer correctly, perhaps Ms. Harlows can clarify, that the Libertarian Party of Utah and other Libertarian parties, our affiliate parties, are in favor of the basic idea, but would also share our perspective that we want to look very carefully at the wording, that they have not given us any sort of blanket decide to participate. They would also want to be sure that the wording accords with our values.
Oh yeah, correct. The inquiry, I believe, to Chair Bookman was just to make sure that we weren't treading on any toes, that they knew we were looking at it and that we had their blessing to do that, but it wasn't any kind of blank check.
Yes, I rather imagined that. Thank you.
Yeah, I read it as they recognize that the issue in the case is one that's important to them and would like the side that we've been asked to be amicus to prevail. And that's about all I read into it, because I don't know if they had any outline or any other materials at the point that they wrote those emails. I think they just knew that the case was proceeding. Other questions for Oliver? If not, I would entertain a motion.
May I make a suggestion first? And that is,
yes, go ahead.
I think we should resolve the deadline issue. In other words, when is a reasonable date that the committee will require delivery of a draft for review and approval, so that we can build that into any motion.
They've got a November 12th filing deadline?
Yes.
The Supreme Court is paper filed, so you're actually looking at close of business November 12th on the East Coast? or 4 o'clock-ish.
Well, FedEx
so,
delivery, yes. Sorry.
Yeah. So you're not getting midnight on the 12th. So you back off of that 2 days. I would say close a business on the 9th for a draft. I mean, polishing and citations and, making sure that references work and it's formatted properly are fine, but a substantive draft by, the evening of the 9th. Does that sound reasonable without pressing somebody?
November 12th is a federal holiday. Is the courts open that on Veterans
Oh, is
Day?
it?
Yeah, it's Veterans Day.
The
The 11th is on a Sunday. Following day is a holiday. In that case,
do they get the 13th?
Most likely it would be the 13th. I am repeating the date that was given to me.
Right.
But if that's a holiday, then then it would be the next day.
But let's still say, does it still seem reasonable to say the 9th? Both from our side and from, not putting undue pressure on whoever is writing this?
Yeah. I think it's reasonable to write this amicus brief in 9 days, especially when they've already been working on it.
So our is we're going to join somebody else's brief rather than simply write one our own in that time period?
Yeah, well, no one's actually brought up that option, but it requires the expenditure of money, which is in short supply.
Right.
And finding an attorney on which to spend that money, which I don't think we have lined up. So does receiving it on the evening of the 9th give enough time, Dr. Lark, Ms. Harlos, and anyone else to review it and get comments back to Oliver?
Mr.
For
Chairman.
me, yes.
Mr. Chairman, I will be boarding an airplane to fly to Dublin, Ireland, and then on to Manchester as of 5:40 p.m. on Friday, November 9th. I should be able. One would hope that I would be able to get it before I get on my airplane, and well, it's not actually my airplane; it belongs to Aer Lingus, and would be able to review it and get my comments back by sometime on Saturday. I certainly should have some time on Saturday, November 10th, to look it over and offer some comments.
Okay.
I hope that I won't need to offer any comments.
Hope springs eternal. Oliver, does that sound like an okay schedule that you're comfortable going to the other amici and it doesn't make it sound unreasonable?
It does, and to the extent that they're crunched for time, it's because we just got this request, and so.
Mr. Hall, this is Jim Lark. If I may inquire, you mentioned that there are other amici, in addition to perhaps not libertarian parties. Could you be a little more specific?
I have the list in front of me.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's I had the list in front of me right when I volunteered it. Do you have the list in front of you, Oliver, now that
I was just
here it
about
is.
to call it up?
LP California, National Constitution Party, Republican Party of Idaho, and the Utah Republican Native American Caucus are the ones that are known at present. It sounds like potentially the Utah Party.
And I'm told that other parties may join as well.
Right. Well, Mr. Chairman, I would think from at least the list that you provided there, I don't know that there would be any of those parties would object violently to the point that we're making and the concern that we have. I also, by the way, my initial impression when I read the goals was precisely the point that you and Mr. Hall made, was that this was purely a point to try not to get the Supreme Court to basically say we're really not going to consider this because you're you're basically going sort of full libertarian on this point. So
yeah.
I would be surprised if any of the other amici were to be extremely upset with our making this point. I don't know that they would. They may want to keep the language as is, or to perhaps modify it somewhat, keeping the basic point, but I don't know that they would be very upset by what we're suggesting. And I don't know that any of the other parties would bring into the amicus brief something else that would cause us to have real problems. So my hope would be that we could look at this, if we get it by the late afternoon of the 9th, we would be able to review this and provide fairly quick turnaround.
Okay. Sam, do you want to do the motion?
I was just dreaming it up as you were thinking about asking me. I would move that the Libertarian National Committee tentatively, well, based on final approval after review, join amicus brief in Utah Republican Party v. Cox.
Pardon me, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Harlow,
I assume that is someone banging away.
Sorry. That's me. Sorry. I'll go on mute here. Hold on.
I have a hard enough time hearing myself think when there's not a clickety clap. So what did I say so far?
You said that you were moving that the Libertarian National Committee tentatively join on to an amicus brief in Utah Republican Party versus Cox under
with
the
final approval predicated on our review of the amicus brief with a deadline no later than 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I guess, November 9th.
Yeah, correct.
So somebody could wordsmith that little thing into a more coherent motion.
That's actually very coherent.
And also that we would authorize spending a pro rata share for printing costs if needed.
Okay. Is there a question before there's a second? Is there a second?
Mr. Chairman, I will second.
Tim.
Thank you, Dr. Lark. Is there any further discussion before we proceed to a vote? Hearing none, Ms. Harlos, if you could take the roll.
Okay, 1 second. Mr. Goldstein?
Yes.
Mr. Hagan?
Yes.
I will vote yes. Dr. Lark?
Aye.
Mr. Merced?
Aye.
And I do not believe Mr. Red passed in the room, but I want to call his name to make sure. Okay, he is not. And would the chair like to vote? It is 5 in favor, 0 opposed.
I will choose not to vote.
Do we need 2/3 of the executive committee to approve this, or some specific number?
I believe 2/3 is the requirement, but with
Of the
5
committee or of those present? Okay.
I believe it's 2/3. It's a 2/3 vote of the committee, so that would. I think that ends up being 2/3 of those present. I'd have to reread that bylaw, but I think that with it being 5-0, we are at the 2/3.
It does not matter, Mr. Chairman. It will pass either way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Is there any further business?
Mr. Chairman, I think it's appropriate for the EC to thank Mr. Hall for his work in this matter.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Hall.
Thank you, and I will contact counsel for the Amici tomorrow morning by email to convey what was decided in this call, and I will notify the listserv of any further developments prior to the 9th. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
All right. If there's nothing else, we will be adjourned. Thank you all for taking the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too. Bye.
conference muted.